Move on. The next section is the recommendations for economic sustainability agriculture. There are 5 recommendations, 4 which Mr. Ray has tentatively identified as consistent, maybe with some language changes needed, and 1 inconsistent. Mr. Ray.
Yeah, really in some ways this conversation will echo the one we've just had. I think, we have had in the a performance measure that's much like the first recommended strategy in the draft Delta plan, and it's been relatively roundly criticized. And I think our sense is that that may be a great aspiration. It's a desirable outcome, but it doesn't fully reflect, at least our understanding of the potential for some change that's inherent in the discussion of the Delta as an evolving place. And so I think our thinking now is captured more closely by the second recommendation to limit the loss of productive farmland to the greatest extent practical from losses for a variety of purposes. And then again, the protect water quality supplies for agriculture. Certainly that's part of the responsibility of the State Water Resources Control Board, and that would be one of the duties that they would be responsible for as they carry out the various actions that they do for water quality purposes. Supporting growth in agritourism as certainly seems a positive thing, as recommended by both state parks and UC Davis's report. And additional value-added crop processing is certainly another thing that would make a lot of sense in increasing the value of agriculture. Of course, new processing facilities, as I understand the National Flood Insurance Program standards that would apply, would all need to be designed so that they were flood-proofed and that facilities were protected against flood damage.
So in this, you said you thought all of them but 1 was consistent, right? And that was the first one, maintain and enhance the value of agriculture.
Yeah, and again, it's because I think it's not consistent with our view of sort of what an evolving place means.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you about number 2, or maybe Mike. So, Mike, when I read your summary on the table,
this is on number 2.
Yeah, this is right. Right, number 2. When you get to habitat, it says habitat measures must target existing public lands, lower value agricultural lands, encourage habitat-friendly agriculture, and consider adjusting acreage goals as discussed in the habitat recommendations. So that's more constructive than the summary proposal title, which is limit the loss of productive farmland to urbanization, habitat, and flooding to the greatest practical extent. Which is the language that you want us to adopt? See, the summary part makes habitat the equivalent of urbanization, and I don't think it is. And I don't think that's what the Delta Protection Act says it is, and I don't think that's the purpose of the co-equal goals. On the other hand, when you describe your summary of it, it suggests that habitat ought to be found in areas that minimize the reduction of agriculture, which is a more positive way of dealing with it.
Well, I think there's a couple things here. One is, if you're going to, habitat ought to be dedicated first priority to public lands. Then you have 2 codes that I think are relevant here. 29703 says that you should protect the primary zone agriculture from non-agricultural uses. So that could be interpreted too that that's habitat conversion. And I think this goes back to some of the ambiguity that exists, or the inconsistency that exists between regulations, because you got 29702A, which we've already talked about. You got 29703, which was not changed in the past legislation, that talks about, quote unquote, holding agriculture unchanged. And then you have the whole concept of evolving place that is not defined in the legislation. And so we're having multiple.
Would you say holding agriculture in place? What was that?
29703 says that the Delta primary zone should be protected from non-agricultural uses. That's not in the statutes and the codes.
From the 92 Act.
Yes, that wasn't changed in the 92 Act.
That was changed.
Was not.
Was not changed.
That particular section was not changed. So I think your premise, I don't think there's any objection. There would be any objection that you ought to be looking at putting habitat in ways that minimize the impact on agriculture. But not.
That's okay. I just don't want to do it under the rubric that habitat is the equivalent of urbanization. Habitat is depleted in the Delta, starting with the creation of the islands that facilitated agriculture. So
but is
the goal of restoring the ecosystem has to include habitat.
But is a degradation in the ecosystem a function of the levees that have been in existence for over 150 years, or is it a function of the way the Delta has been operated in the last 20 years?
All of it.
To what degree? Because prior to the dependence on the pumps to expanded exporting, we didn't have the decline in the aquatic problems. And it could be argued that the impacts of that on the what perceived as semi-natural functions in the Delta has contributed to the invasive species.
Right. And before the creation of the islands, it wasn't semi-natural, it was natural.
That's right. But we were also constrained by the Swamp Act that said that once the state signed on to that, it was obligated to develop and to further the economy of the area and contribute to the state.
I understand. I'm just not prepared to say that economic considerations trump the co-equal goals.
But the statute basically implies that.
This report, the economic sustainability plan is a part of the mosaic of the Delta plan, to be sure. But the co-equal goals remain the chief objective of the law and of our obligation. And there is a refrain that repeats itself through Delta interest conversations that habitat is a bad thing. Yes. And or it needs to be marginalized, or it is a reduction in the value of the Delta. And so I'm certainly interested in inclusion of strategies or recommendations that go to minimizing habitat's reduction on agriculture.
I think we have to put it in kind of in perspective of the development of the ESP and what was going on around it. In December of 2010, you had a draft BDCP that came out that proposed a 15,000 CFS isolated facility. It also proposed up to 160,000 acres of habitat restoration. It talked about significant restoration to occur in the Ola Basin, as well as significant tidal marsh restoration in the South Delta. So you have that framework going on. You have the metrics that was proposed in draft 5 of what does it mean to preserve and enhance agriculture, and that metric was an increase in agricultural output and value, both in terms of an expansion of agricultural farmland as well as economic value of agriculture. So that would tie in to the objective cited in the legislation that not only do you pursue the co-equal goals, but you do it in a way to enhance, et cetera, as we discussed before in 2702, paragraph A.
You didn't say that the Swamp Act must guide us for 150 years towards putting economic considerations ahead of the environmental considerations of the Delta, did you?
No, I'm trying to put it in perspective as to where we came, how the ESP evolved. I mean, the Swamp Act didn't talk about habitat, but it talked about what the obligation was of the state by granting.
But an isolated facility is not under consideration nor part of the Delta plan. So,
well, not today. You could adopt. You have to consider and potentially adopt the BDCP at some point in the future, and if it has a conveyance in it.
So the ESP spends a lot of time fighting against something that's not on the table.
ESP
I get that, but
no, it's not fighting against it. What the ESP is said that is out there as what kind of a project could impact the Delta, and what the ESP shows is if a scale of that type of a project would have could have a magnitude of impacts this way. If that were to become a proposal, the ESP would say no, it's not appropriate because it doesn't meet the constraints of the legislation in that.
Right.
Now, the last part is my words, but I think that's what the intention is in terms of bringing that about. I think the Swamp Act was silent on habitat. It was mainly looked at development,
correct,
economic activity.
Correct.
So, and you take the legislation. What I'm trying to, that's the context in which the ESP moved forward. And to make the recommendation that it's being done.
I understand, but you would understand why I would want to characterize the policies that should guide habitat development in a way that affirms the co-equal goals and hopefully minimizes or mitigates the economic impacts that you cite.
I think the mutual objective is balance. And what we have is, and I think we talked about it yesterday, we got a plan that's to be implemented over 50 years and evaluated in either 5 or 10-year stages for adaptation. But there's a fear that's been expressed at the local government level that if we're talking about potentially converting large acreage of farmland to habitat, or allowing for islands not to be resuscitated if they're flooded, that because of the application of covered actions, that would prevent any activity taking place that's different from what it is today. And an example of that is the response of the council staff to Sassoon Marsh activities, where it was implied that if land was not flooded but was developed, that would cause an opportunity for further oxidation and subsidence, that those activities would be under a covered action and not be allowed. And the inference that's been taken from that it could be applied to any type of agricultural operation that tills the land that causes oxidation and further subsidence. And so you have these tensions that are out there that are based on not necessarily the adaptation going forward, but the end results, because it's identified, it's the magnitude could be this, and then you have this correspondence that comes in that tends to say that there's this wholesale jurisdiction over it.
That was good, Mike. You shifted the ground where you had stronger arguments, and I know less.
But that is also a mischaracterization of the conversation we had with Sue and RC&D, and that was in many ways a discussion about a quite different situation than existing agricultural use of farmlands in the Delta. There's no need to go into the details of it now, but it's certainly not the message we were trying to convey to the RC&D or the point of view we have.
I'd just add that the ESP is not putting these local economic interests above the co-equal goals, but it was constructed as viewing them as an additional goal to be achieved. I think is written in the Act, so more of as a constraint on efforts to achieve them.
And then I'll get off and move on. It says, you're an economist. You're interested in how people make money and how they make more money, and that's what the prism through which most things get looked at.
No, actually, it's a prism of maximizing social welfare. I mean, if we were to write a plan that was to maximize income for the 5 Delta counties, it would look very different than what you've seen here. It would not embrace holding the line on current city limits.
Right,
but
the local business and inevitably the local government view of these issues as repeatedly voiced is stay away from our opportunities to urbanize in the secondary zone because there's money to be made, and then pay us full mitigation for anything you change in the primary zone that might have less economic value than what is being done now.
That's a political characterization of
it is
of the relationship between local government and state policy.
And in some sense, this is the tension.
Yes.
You are a state agency with local officials assuming a state-appointed role. Okay, nothing wrong with that. And the question here is, what's a state interest? What's a local interest? Which comes first? How are they judged and balanced against each other? It comes as no surprise to you that I believe almost everybody in the state of California has helped contribute to the problems of the Delta and owes a duty to contribute to the solutions as well. I am reading laboriously and only just started the comments on the EIR, but I've read all the comments on the Delta plan. And I think it's almost universal that everyone wishes to be excluded from any responsibility for harming the Delta, but they don't mind if other people are accused of and held accountable for that. And if you add up all the comments we've received, everybody in California would exclude themselves, thus continuing the status quo, which nobody likes and the legislature has declared is unsustainable. And it is. So we got to figure out a way out of this.
But
I concur with Pat in general on the comments. I think it's not just related to water supply. It's a large number of issues and factors that contribute.
But if you're looking for specific language from the ESP to incorporate it into the Delta plan at this juncture.
This what?
If you're looking at the language in the ESP to be language that can be incorporated or not incorporated into the Delta plan, I don't think that's a wrong way to look at the ESP.
You were urging us to keep in the performance measure that some have said is a guaranteed annual income
We wholeheartedly support staff's recommendation from the council in draft
a guaranteed annual income.
5. That's your interpretation. That was not theirs.
Give me a different phrase. Yeah, Mike, give me a different phrase.
That's the sustainability of agriculture
Within the Delta?
within the Delta.
Okay, and so if land within the Delta is taken out of agricultural production, what should be done?
Well, what we've shown is that there's a conversion of there's a transition of higher value crops coming into the Delta.
And that'll mitigate some of the impact, which is okay.
We
Generally
showed,
okay.
we showed that there's a mitigation there that can take place, and there's a percentage of farmland that's reasonably could be lost and not lose anything. And that is a function of economic factors outside of the Delta that's occurring in the region. Right. And I think that is something that Sutherland did not look at when he made his report about to us about agriculture in the Delta. You know, this is really dynamic. You know, and there's a lot of interpretation that can be made from all of this. If the ESP as a staff is looked at from the standpoint of this is what the economy of the Delta looks at. These are the factors that are there. These are the concerns that have been registered, and some of these to make it sure that the researchers were directed in some of this language because of the interest of local government. And I think that's fully reflected in the fully mitigated part of that, which, you know, we can debate. But if you're looking for the proposals to become specific language, I think there's a discussion that needs to take place between the respective staffs.
Well, you know, that'll go on anyway. And we'd all encourage that. But we need to understand the concepts because, as you know, we have not acted on the fifth draft Delta plan. That is a staff proposed document. We're going to look at the EIR. There will undoubtedly be changes that will occur. How significant, I do not know. But we need to know the thrust of it and the argument. Okay.